Imagine surviving years of brutal captivity, starvation, and disease in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, only to be killed by your own country's submarine. This is not a nightmare. This is the tragic reality faced by thousands of Allied prisoners of war during World War II, who perished not at the hands of their captors, but from American torpedoes fired in the dark waters of the Pacific. These vessels, known as Hell ships, became floating coffins where friend and foe alike met their fate in one of the war's most heartbreaking chapters of friendly fire. Today, we're going to uncover the forgotten story of the Japanese Hell ships and the Allied prisoners who died waiting for rescue that came in the form of destruction. The Pacific War was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. Spanning millions of square miles of ocean, thousands of islands, and involving nations from across the globe, it was a war fought with unprecedented ferocity. When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the world. Within months, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific like a tidal wave. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines, an American Commonwealth, saw its defenders pushed back into the Bataan Peninsula before finally surrendering in May 1942. With each conquered territory came prisoners. Thousands upon thousands of Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen found themselves captive in a foreign land, governed by an enemy whose military culture viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. The Japanese military operated under the code of Bushido, which emphasized loyalty, honor, and death before surrender. To a Japanese soldier, surrendering was considered shameful beyond measure. This cultural perspective had devastating consequences for Allied prisoners of war. If Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender, how should they treat enemy soldiers who chose captivity over death? The answer, for many Japanese commanders and guards, was with contempt and brutality. The treatment of Allied POWs in Japanese captivity was systematic and horrific. Prisoners were subjected to starvation rations, often receiving only a handful of rice per day. Tropical diseases like malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and cholera ravaged the camps. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Beatings were routine, often administered for the smallest infractions or for no reason at all. Prisoners were forced into slave labor, building railways, working in mines, and constructing military fortifications. The death rate in Japanese POW camps was approximately 27%, compared to less than 4% in German camps holding Western Allied prisoners. But the nightmare didn't end in the camps. As the war turned against Japan and Allied forces began pushing back across the Pacific, the Japanese faced a dilemma. What should they do with the tens of thousands of prisoners scattered across their shrinking empire? The answer was to move them. Prisoners needed to be transported from the conquered territories back to Japan or to other locations where they could continue to provide labor for the Japanese war machine. The vessels used for these transports would become known as Hell ships, and they would prove to be death traps of unimaginable horror. The Hell ships were typically old, decrepit cargo vessels, never designed to carry human passengers. The Japanese made virtually no modifications to accommodate the prisoners. Men were packed into cargo holds with no ventilation, no sanitation facilities, and barely enough room to sit down, let alone lie down. Imagine being crammed into a space so tight that you're pressed against other men on all sides. The tropical heat is suffocating. There's no fresh air. The stench of sweat, vomit, and human waste is overwhelming. You have no idea where you're going or how long the journey will last. You might get a cup of water once a day if you're lucky. Food is scarce, sometimes just a ball of rice. Men around you are dying from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and disease. Their bodies remain in the hold because there's nowhere to put them. This was the reality aboard the Hell ships. One of the most infamous Hell ship voyages was the Oryoku Maru in December 1944. This ship departed Manila with over 1,600 American prisoners crammed into its holds. The conditions were beyond description. Men went mad from the heat and thirst. Some killed others trying to get to the small amount of water available. Others drank their own urine in desperation. The ship had no markings indicating it carried prisoners of war. To American aircraft and submarines, it looked like any other Japanese cargo vessel, which made it a legitimate military target. On December 14th, American planes attacked the Oryoku Maru. Bombs struck the ship, and prisoners were killed both by the bombing and by panicked Japanese guards who fired into the holds. The survivors were forced to abandon ship and swim to shore, where they were strafed by American planes who had no idea they were shooting at their own countrymen. Of the 1,600 men who boarded the Orioka Maru, only around 400 would survive to reach Japan. But the Orioka Maru was just one of many hell ships. The Arisen Maru, which departed Manila in October 1944, carried over 1,800 American prisoners. On October 24th, the ship was torpedoed by the American submarine USS Shark. The Japanese guards battened down the hatches, trapping the prisoners below as the ship sank. Only 9 men escaped and survived. Over 1,800 Americans drowned in the holds of that ship, killed by an American torpedo. The Junyo Maru was torpedoed in September 1944 by the British submarine HMS Tradewind. It was carrying over 6,000 people, including about 2,000 Allied POWs and over 4,000 Japanese slave laborers. When the ship sank, more than 5,000 people died, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. The submarine commander had no way of knowing what his torpedo had done. This brings us to the heart of the tragedy. Why were these ships being sunk by Allied forces? The answer lies in the nature of submarine warfare and the Japanese refusal to mark POW transports. Under international law, specifically the Geneva Conventions, ships carrying prisoners of war were supposed to be clearly marked and their routes communicated to the enemy to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Hospital ships, for example, were painted white with large red crosses and were generally respected as off-limits by both sides. But Japan refused to mark hell ships or notify the Allies of their movements. From the Japanese perspective, doing so would reveal their shipping routes and schedules to the enemy, making their vessels easier targets. They also didn't want to divert shipping resources solely for POW transport when every vessel was needed for military supplies. So prisoners were loaded onto whatever ships were available, mixed in with military cargo, ammunition, and troops. From the American submarine perspective, they were operating in a war zone with orders to sink Japanese shipping. Every Japanese cargo ship potentially carried supplies to enemy forces. Every troop transport potentially carried soldiers who would fight American Marines on the next island. The submarines operated largely blind, relying on periscope observations and intelligence reports. In the dark waters of the Pacific, a submarine commander had seconds to make a decision. Is that ship a legitimate military target? The answer was almost always yes. Fire the torpedoes. Only later, sometimes much later, would the terrible truth emerge. That ship had been carrying Allied prisoners. Your own countrymen. The psychological toll on submarine commanders and crews who later learned they had killed Allied POWs was devastating. These were not war crimes. These were tragedies born of war's chaos and the fog of battle. Commander Eli Reich, captain of the USS Celian, sank the Rikuyo Maru in September 1944. The ship was carrying over 1,300 British and Australian POWs. Reich had no idea prisoners were aboard. After sinking the ship, his submarine surfaced and the crew saw men in the water. At first, they thought they were Japanese survivors. But then they heard English voices crying out for help. The horror of what had happened became immediately clear. Reich and other American submarine commanders in the area spent days rescuing survivors, pulling over 100 men from the water. But more than 1,000 had already drowned. Reich was haunted by this incident for the rest of his life, even though he had done nothing wrong. He had simply been doing his job in wartime. The hell ships claimed thousands of lives through multiple means of death. Some men died from the horrific conditions aboard the ships even before any attack. Heat stroke, dehydration, starvation, and disease killed prisoners during the voyages. Others died when the ships were attacked, either from the explosions, fires, or drowning. Still others were killed by their own guards. When ships came under attack, Japanese guards often panicked and fired into the holds where prisoners were kept, or they would batten down the hatches, deliberately trapping men below as the ship went down. Some guards would shoot prisoners who tried to escape the sinking vessels. In a few documented cases, prisoners who made it to the water were machine-gunned by Japanese escort vessels, or even by the guards in lifeboats. Yet there were also stories of remarkable survival, and even moments of humanity. After the Rikuyo Maru sinking, American submarines rescued survivors, but many men were left behind in the vast ocean. Some clung to debris for days. Australian soldier Roy Cornford survived 5 days in the water before being picked up by a Japanese whaling ship. He weighed just 80 pounds when he was finally rescued. Some Japanese sailors and guards did show compassion. There are accounts of individual Japanese crew members secretly bringing water to prisoners or helping them escape sinking ships. These moments of humanity, rare as they were, remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, individual choices matter. The scale of death on the Hell ships is staggering. Historians estimate that approximately 21,000 Allied prisoners of war died aboard Japanese transport vessels during World War II. This number includes those who died from the conditions aboard the ships and those killed when the ships were sunk. To put this in perspective, more American prisoners died on Hell ships than were killed at the Battle of Iwo Jima. The Japanese transported approximately 50,000 Allied POWs by sea during the war. This means that approximately 40% of prisoners who boarded Hell ships never reached their destination alive. Think about those odds. A 40% death rate. If you were forced to board a Hell ship, you had less than a 2 in 3 chance of surviving the voyage. The voyages varied in length from a few days to several weeks, depending on the route and destination. Ships traveling from the Philippines to Japan typically took 1 to 2 weeks, but could take longer if the ship had to take evasive routes to avoid submarines, or if it stopped at multiple ports. Throughout the voyage, prisoners had virtually no information about what was happening. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know how long the journey would last. They didn't know if they would survive. All they could do was endure hour after hour, day after day, in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Many survivors later said that the Hell ship voyages were worse than years in the prison camps. At least in the camps, you could move around, get fresh air, and had some routine. On the Hell ships, you were trapped in a dark, suffocating space with death all around you. The psychological trauma was profound. Men hallucinated from dehydration. They fought each other over drops of water. They watched friends die and were powerless to help them. Some went insane. Others gave up and died even though they might have physically survived if they had maintained the will to live. Let's talk about some specific Hell ship voyages to understand the full horror. The Shinyo Maru departed Mindanao in the Philippines in September 1944 with 750 American prisoners. On September 7th, it was torpedoed by the USS Paddle. The ship began to sink, and Japanese guards opened fire on prisoners trying to escape. Survivors who made it into the water were strafed by machine gun fire. Of the 750 prisoners aboard, only 82 survived. The Brazil Maru voyage in October 1944 saw prisoners packed so tightly that men died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them. When the ship finally arrived in Japan, and the holds were opened, bodies tumbled out like cordwood. The Hafuku Maru carried British and Dutch prisoners from Singapore. Conditions were so bad that prisoners were forced to cannibalize the dead to survive. The voyage lasted weeks, and by the time the ship reached Japan, a significant portion of the prisoners had perished. The Montevideo Maru, sunk in July 1942 by the American submarine USS Sturgeon, was carrying over 1,000 Australian prisoners and civilians from Rabaul. All were killed when the ship went down. This remains Australia's worst maritime disaster. For decades, the families of those lost had no idea what had happened to their loved ones. They were simply listed as missing. It wasn't until after the war that the truth emerged, and even then, many details remained unclear for years. The lack of records compounds the tragedy of the Hell ships. The Japanese kept poor records of prisoner movements, and many records that did exist were destroyed at the end of the war. Families often didn't know their loved ones had been aboard Hell ships. Men were listed as killed in action or died in captivity, with no details about the circumstances. It took years, sometimes decades, of research by historians and veterans organizations to piece together what had happened. Some Hell ship sinkings weren't fully documented until the 1980s or 90s, more than 40 years after the events. The experience of Hell ship survivors after reaching their destination was often just more suffering. Those who survived the voyage to Japan were put to work in mines, factories, and shipyards, often in conditions nearly as bad as the Hell ships themselves. They worked in coal mines where cave-ins and explosions were common. They labored in copper mines where toxic fumes sickened and killed them. They worked in factories producing war materials, sometimes the very weapons that would be used against their countrymen. And they did this while still starving, still sick, still being beaten, right up until Japan surrendered in August 1945. When liberation finally came, it was bittersweet for Hell ship survivors. Yes, the war was over. Yes, they would go home, but they had been through experiences that would haunt them forever. Many survivors never spoke about what they endured, not even to their families. The trauma was too deep, the memories too painful. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized or treated the way it is today, so these men simply had to live with their nightmares, their survivor's guilt, and their psychological scars. Survivor's guilt was particularly acute for those who knew they had survived when so many others had died. Why did I live when my friend died right next to me? What could I have done differently? These questions tormented many veterans for the rest of their lives. The submarine commanders who unknowingly sank Hell ships also carried a burden. They had been doing their duty, following orders, fighting the war the way they were trained to fight it. But knowing that your actions, however justified and necessary, resulted in the deaths of your own countrymen is a weight few can bear easily. After the war, there were debates about whether Japan should have been held more accountable for the Hell ship deaths. At the Tokyo war crimes trials, Japanese officials were prosecuted for mistreatment of prisoners, and some were executed or imprisoned. However, the specific issue of unmarked Hell ships received less attention than other atrocities. Part of the reason was that proving intent was difficult. Had the Japanese deliberately put prisoners on unmarked ships knowing they would be sunk? Or was it simply a matter of wartime expedience and indifference to prisoner welfare? The evidence suggests it was primarily the latter. Japan's merchant fleet was being decimated by American submarines. They needed every available ship for military purposes and couldn't spare vessels solely for POW transport. Marking the ships and notifying the Allies would compromise operational security. The welfare of prisoners, who they viewed with contempt anyway, was simply not a priority. This wasn't a deliberate plan to have prisoners killed by Allied action. It was callous indifference that had the same result. Some Japanese officers after the war expressed regret about the Hell ships. Others maintained they had done nothing wrong, that prisoners were lucky to be transported at all rather than simply executed. This attitude, this inability or unwillingness to see prisoners as human beings deserving of basic dignity, was at the core of why the Hell ships were allowed to operate the way they did. It's important to understand the context of submarine warfare in the Pacific. American submarines were incredibly effective, sinking more Japanese shipping than all other causes combined. They strangled Japan's economy and war machine by cutting off the flow of oil, rubber, food, and other resources from conquered territories. The submarines operated under unrestricted warfare rules, meaning any enemy vessel was a legitimate target. This was necessary because Japan used civilian ships for military purposes, and distinguishing between purely civilian and military cargo was often impossible. Every Japanese ship sunk was one less vessel carrying resources to support the war effort. The submarine crews were heroes doing vital, dangerous work. They had no way to know some of those ships carried Allied prisoners. The technology of the time must also be considered. Submarines in World War II didn't have the sophisticated sensors and intelligence capabilities of modern vessels. They operated mostly on visual sightings through periscopes. They received intelligence updates when possible, but communication was limited. A submarine on patrol might go weeks without receiving messages. Even if the Allies had somehow known that a particular ship carried POWs, communicating that information to submarines at sea in time to prevent an attack would have been extremely difficult. And again, Japan didn't mark the ships or provide manifests, so the Allies usually had no idea which vessels carried prisoners. There were a few instances where intelligence did identify Hell ships, and efforts were made to avoid attacking them. But these were rare exceptions. The vast majority of Hell ships sailed with their deadly cargo unknown to Allied forces. After the war, survivors advocated for recognition and remembrance of the Hell ship victims. Veterans organizations pushed for memorials and for the stories to be included in official histories. In some countries, this happened relatively quickly. In others, it took decades. In the United States, the Hell ship story was overshadowed by other aspects of the Pacific War. The atomic bombs, the island hopping campaign, major battles like Midway and Iwo Jima received far more attention. The Hell ships were a footnote, if mentioned at all. In Australia, where the Montevideo Maru disaster claimed over 1,000 lives, the tragedy has received more recognition, though even there it took many years. Memorials have been erected, and annual remembrance ceremonies are held. Families of the victims have worked tirelessly to ensure their loved ones are not forgotten. In recent years, there has been increased interest in the Hell ship story. Books have been written, documentaries produced, and survivors interviewed while that was still possible. Most hell ship survivors have now passed away, taking their first-hand accounts with them. But their testimonies, recorded in memoirs, interviews, and oral histories, preserve the truth of what happened. These accounts are difficult to read. They describe suffering almost beyond comprehension. But they are important. They remind us of the cost of war, not just in battles fought and won or lost, but in the individual human suffering that occurs in war's chaos. The hell ships also raise important questions about the laws of war and the treatment of prisoners. The Geneva Conventions existed during World War II, but they were often ignored, particularly in the Pacific theater. After the war, the conventions were updated and strengthened, partly in response to the atrocities that had occurred, including the hell ship deaths. Today, the rules governing the transport of prisoners of war are much more specific. Transporting powers are required to mark vessels carrying POWs, provide manifests to enemy powers through neutral intermediaries, and ensure humane conditions during transport. Whether these rules would be followed in a major modern conflict is uncertain, but at least the legal framework exists in a way it didn't adequately before. The hell ships also illustrate the danger of dehumanizing the enemy. The Japanese military culture that led to the brutal treatment of POWs was built on the idea that surrender was shameful and that those who surrendered were less than human. This allowed guards and commanders to inflict suffering without moral qualms. It's a reminder that one of the most dangerous things that can happen in war is when one side stops seeing the other as human beings. We must also remember that the Allied prisoners on hell ships came from many nations. Americans, Australians, British, Dutch, Canadians, and others all suffered and died together. The war in the Pacific involved nations from across the globe, and the POW experience reflected that diversity. Men from different countries, different backgrounds, different cultures were thrown together in the worst circumstances imaginable. Often they supported each other, shared what little they had, and helped each other survive. National boundaries mattered less than shared humanity when you were all starving and suffering together. There are accounts of American prisoners sharing their meager rations with British or Australian prisoners who were weaker. Of Australian medics tending to Dutch prisoners despite having no supplies. Of acts of kindness and solidarity that transcended nationality. These stories provide some light in a very dark chapter of history. Let's take a moment to think about the families back home. Imagine you're a wife, a mother, a father, a sibling of a man captured in the Philippines or Singapore. You receive notification that your loved one is a prisoner of war. That's all you know. You have no idea what conditions he's living in. You don't know if he's being treated humanely. You can't communicate with him. You just have to wait and hope. Then the war ends, and the prisoners start coming home. But your loved one isn't among them. You wait for more information. Maybe he's in a hospital somewhere, too sick to travel yet. Maybe the records are confused, and he'll turn up. Weeks pass, then months. Finally, you receive notification. Your loved one died in captivity. The date is listed as sometime in 1944 or 1945. Place of death, at sea. Cause of death, unknown or ship sinking. No other details. For many families, that was all they ever learned. They never knew about the hell ships, never knew the specifics of how their loved one died. They were left with questions that would never be answered. Where exactly did he die? Did he suffer? Was he thinking of home at the end? These unanswered questions haunted families for generations. Some families spent years, even decades, searching for information. They contacted veterans organizations, read memoirs of survivors, attended reunions hoping to find someone who had known their loved one. Sometimes they found answers. Often they didn't. The hell ship story also connects to larger questions about memory and history. How do we remember wars? What stories get told and retold, and which ones are forgotten? The hell ships were a significant tragedy, but they've been largely absent from popular understanding of World War II. Why? Partly because the story is complicated. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of heroism and victory. It's a story of victims and tragedy, of friendly fire and chaos. It's uncomfortable. It raises questions about the costs of war that we might prefer not to confront. But uncomfortable stories are often the most important ones to tell. They remind us that war is not glorious, that victory comes at a terrible price, and that even the necessary wars create suffering that echoes through generations. As we approach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of history, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from the hell ship tragedy. First, the importance of following international law and the rules of war. Japan's refusal to mark POW transports and treat prisoners humanely led directly to thousands of deaths. Second, the recognition that in war's chaos, terrible mistakes happen. Allied submarines were doing their duty, but the result was the deaths of their own countrymen. War is never clean or simple. Third, the value of bearing witness and preserving memory. The Hell Ship survivors who told their stories, despite the pain of reliving them, ensured that those who died would not be forgotten. Fourth, the reminder of our common humanity. Whether Japanese, American, British, Australian, or any other nationality, we're all human beings capable of suffering. The moment we forget, that is the moment atrocities become possible. The Hell Ships were a tragedy of staggering proportions. 21,000 men died, many of them killed by their own side's weapons while imprisoned by the enemy. They survived capture, prison camps, disease, and brutality, only to die at sea, trapped in the holds of unmarked ships. Some drowned as the ships went down. Others were killed by explosions or gunfire. Still others died from the horrific conditions aboard the ships before any attack ever came. Each death was an individual tragedy, a life cut short, a family left to mourn. Multiply that by 21,000, and you begin to grasp the scale of the loss. But numbers alone don't tell the story. Behind each number was a person. A son, a husband, a father, a brother, a friend. Someone who laughed and loved, who had dreams and hopes, who wanted nothing more than to survive the war and go home. They deserved better than to die in the darkness of a ship's hold, killed by the weapons of their own countrymen who had no idea they were there. Today, memorials stand in various countries honoring those who died on the Hell Ships. The names of the lost are inscribed in stone, ensuring they will not be forgotten. Veterans organizations continue to advocate for recognition and education about the Hell Ships. Historians continue to research and document the voyages, trying to piece together exactly what happened to each ship and each group of prisoners. And the descendants of Hell Ship victims and survivors work to keep the memory alive, sharing their family stories and ensuring that future generations know what happened in the dark waters of the Pacific so many years ago. The Hell Ships remind us that war's costs extend far beyond the battlefield. They remind us that the line between tragedy and atrocity can be thin, and that good people can become caught in circumstances beyond their control with devastating results. They remind us to honor not just the heroes, but also the victims, and to remember that every casualty of war is a human being whose loss echoes through time. As we close this chapter, we remember the men who boarded the Hell Ships. We remember their courage in enduring the unendurable. We remember those who survived and carried the weight of memory for the rest of their lives. And we remember those who died, whose final moments were in darkness and fear, far from home and family. They were prisoners of war, but they were also soldiers who had fought for their countries. They deserved to be treated with dignity and humanity. They deserved to survive the war and return home. Instead, they became casualties of war's chaos, of cultural contempt for prisoners, and of the simple, terrible bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. May their memory be a blessing and a reminder. May we never forget what happened on the Hell Ships. And may we always strive to ensure that in future conflicts, if they must occur, we remember the lessons written in the blood and suffering of those who died in the holds of unmarked ships in the Pacific, killed by friend and foe alike, waiting for a rescue that never came.